Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Walk Daily. With you, as always, it's me, Micah Holt. All right, now, I told you last week, I mentioned that we were going to talk about one of my favorite Bible stories, and that was Joseph. The story of Joseph is a great story, and I hope that you have read that. But as I was writing all my notes and then went to transfer all that to my computer and start getting ready for this lesson, things changed. I started feeling like, hey, there were some more things I needed to talk about and make it a little more broad. So we are going to talk about Joseph a little bit, but it's going to be more about how it relates to this lesson today instead of his whole story. So I hope that you guys are reading along. I hope that you guys have already read through Genesis, maybe even working your way toward Exodus, and if you haven't yet, I hope that you get out there, get your Bible, read through Genesis. It's long, and there's a whole lot of information, but there's a whole lot of really good stuff in there. And there's no way I can cover it all in 15, 20 minutes. So I really want you to get all that you can out of the Lord's word and just really, soak it all up. But I can't cover it all. So I'm going to go over just a little bit here, really 5 points in Genesis, and what we need to know that I got from Genesis here is that God has a plan for us. First of all, before we get to Genesis, we'll go over to Jeremiah 29:11, and that says, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Now that's a great, great thought to have. Knowing that means that we can have some peace. We talked about peace last week. As a Christ follower, if we take steps daily and weekly and monthly and yearly, everything that we do, we pray about and we do according to what we think God would want us to do, He is going to lead us into the path of good. Again, it may not be this big prosperity thing where we're going to have mansions and Rolls Royce cars and things like that, but He's going to lead us to good. Okay? So, excuse me. It's great to know that God does have a plan. So I'm going to talk, like I said, about 5 points that talk about God's plan. Okay? I want to set this up a little bit here. After the garden, after Adam and Eve, after the flood, along comes God to this guy Abram, and He says, "Abram, I'm going to multiply your generations." And Abram, who later becomes Abraham, he says, that's not really possible. I'm 75 years old. The only real descendant I have is going to be somebody from my house. It's not going to be an actual son. I don't have that yet. And so that doesn't even make sense. God says, nope, it's going to be a son. It's going to be your son that you will have, and I'm going to make it great. And in fact, if you could possibly even count the stars, that's how great in number I'm going to make your offspring. So it's a lot, okay? And so Abram goes along, and he goes out, leaves his home. He finds this lady, Sarai, who becomes Sarah later in the story. And they go on, they do, they've got a lot to do. In fact, it's 10 years later, and they still don't have a kid yet. And that brings us to our first point, okay? And the first point is that we've got to keep our eye on the prize. Okay, we've got to keep God's promise in mind and not try to make it our own, okay? And so here's what happened. They actually tried to do that. So in Genesis 16:2, it says here, "And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." So what that says is basically, she says, "Hey, this ain't working. I'm old. You're old. It's just not working. God hasn't let me have children. So he says you're going to have a kid, so why don't you instead just, why don't you go have sex with my servant? She'll have a kid, but that will be our kids. That will be our kids because she's my servant. Those will be our kids. And Abram says, okay, why not? So basically, they've tried to take what God's plan was but make their plan God's plan and God's plan their plan. They're trying to do God's job, basically. And it doesn't work that way. We have to do what God wants us to do, and in His time. Okay? So the next point here is that, number 2, God might do something that we think is impossible. And in fact, that's kind of the point. See, God had told Abraham later in the story, after he did have sex with Hagar, and excuse me, I'm so sorry. They had a son, Ishmael. Sarai wasn't happy with that. She started to show contempt toward her servant and toward Ishmael, pushed him out. They went away. So another 10 years or so later, God comes back and says, okay, you're going to have this child with Sarah, and this will be the one I make my covenant with. Now, when that happens, Genesis 17:17 says, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90, bear a child? They said that he was 75 when he first was told about this. And another 10 years later, 11 years after that, Ishmael's born. And then another, so I guess that makes it 13 years later after that, they're saying, here's God saying, yeah, you're going to have this kid. And Abraham can't believe it. He can't imagine that that's true. And in fact, in the next chapter, in Genesis 18:12, Sarah, who had heard this, laughs to herself and says, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? They could not believe that this could possibly be true. But by promising something so huge, it can clearly be seen as a God thing, as a miracle. And God likes to do those big things sometimes because it really gives us clarity. It lets us clearly know that God's working. It isn't just happenstance. It isn't something that we did, but it's actually God. So number 3, sometimes God will request something of us to test our faith, but bless us for it. Now, they had been raising Isaac since he was born. They'd raised him up, doing all the things that you would normally do with a son, but also, raising him probably to be this man of God, telling him who God was, telling him about all the great things that God had promised, and helping him to grow up to be that kind of a man. So, after God had given Isaac, and Abraham loved him so much and prepared to follow God's plan, then God comes along and asks for something that would break any of us. Absolutely break us down, tear us apart. I know it would me. He asks him to go sacrifice Isaac, to kill him. It's something I think we gloss over a lot in Sunday school lessons because, well, we're kids and that's pretty heavy. But think about that. God, who said, I will give you this son. I promised you this son. And here he is. He now says, go kill him. Sacrifice him. I honestly don't think I could do it. I love my daughter. I worked really hard to get her here, and my wife worked even harder. And I can't imagine us ever going along with that. But here's the thing. Here in Genesis 22:2, God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now, the interesting thing that I never really noticed until my pastor said it a few months ago. Abraham didn't argue with God. In fact, he didn't waste any time at all. Here in Genesis 22:3, it says, Abraham got up early the next morning and set about this work. He got up early. He got the donkeys together. He got the firewood and so on and so forth. Got all that going together. And he immediately started off to do this. He didn't waste any time. He followed God immediately. Go down a few more verses here, 22:17 through 18 in Genesis 22:17 through 18. After they had gotten to the mountain, they left the servants behind. They carry the wood. They go up. They make the altar. Isaac says to Abraham, hey, we've got all this stuff. We're ready to make our sacrifice, but where's the sacrifice at? Well, Abraham says, God will provide. See, it doesn't really explicitly say this, but I believe that Abraham knew that God would take care of him. He thought that he would provide some sort of other sacrifice, or maybe he thought that he would raise him from the dead, or that God would just do something completely different. But whatever it was, I believe that Abraham knew God would provide and take care of it. And that's why it was so easy for him to just go right ahead. And I think that's because he had seen God work. So, after he raises that knife up and getting ready to come down on Isaac, the angel of the Lord stops him and says, don't do that. Looks over, he sees the ram in the thicket, and there was the sacrifice right there. So, in Genesis 22:17 through 18, it says here, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars in heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all of the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. You see, God will bless us if we obey him. He wants to do that. But sometimes he may ask something of us. We may have to give up a relationship. We may have to give up a job or a career choice. We may have to move away from our home, away from our family. He's going to ask us of something. He's definitely going to ask us to give up certain sins. He's going to want us to put those things aside. And may even be more. It may be something that's going to break us down completely. But he's going to do it so that he can raise us up and bless us. And number 4 is our next point. Number 4, sometimes God may take us through something horrible to get us where he can bless us. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I skipped too far. Joseph. Here we come to Joseph. He was the beloved son of Jacob. And he was somewhat cocky. He was having these dreams, and he was going to his older brothers, and he was telling them about these dreams, and he was like, yeah, this is what's going to happen, And brothers got kind of upset about it. Jacob even got, a little bit worried about it because, he was like, you can't go around doing all this stuff. Can't be being cocky to your brothers. Can't be, taunting them and such. And so there came a time, brothers had had enough. They were going to kill him, but one of the other brothers stood up and said, hey, that's not going to help us at all. If we kill him, it doesn't profit us anything. Why don't we sell him? So they did. In Genesis 37:28, it says, then Midianite traders passed by. They drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Now, one of the hardest things that any of us could probably imagine is to be sold, not just be sold, but to be sold by our family, our brothers, our flesh and blood, those that we love, sold into slavery and made to do whatever we're told and to not have any choice in life. forced into slavery. But that's what happened to Joseph. But Joseph didn't sit there quietly. He didn't give up on God. He stayed true to God. He knew that God was awesome, that he was faithful. And he went about the business that he was forced to do and did it to his absolute greatest. Number 5, fifth point here, God never promised that it would be easy. But if we remain faithful, he'll see us through and build us up. Now, as I said, once in Egypt, where God had planned to prosper Joseph, and with Joseph following God, he still went through trials. You know, it wasn't all easy, just because he followed God. Like I said, obviously he was in slavery already. That was number one. That's bad. But even after that, he got raised up because he was put in charge over the whole house. He was in Potiphar's house and he was placed over everything because he'd done such a great job. The only thing that he couldn't have was Potiphar's wife, which makes sense. So Joseph was doing all the good things, but here comes Potiphar's wife, and she's tempting him. It says here in Genesis 39:7, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Now, she didn't just do that once. She, in fact, did that multiple times. And he refused every single time because of God and because of his master. He knew that it wasn't right to do. So, eventually, after she persisted, she kind of grabbed a hold of him and had a hold of his clothes, and he was trying to run out, and he left his clothes. Well, she then lied and said, "Look, I got his clothes. He tried to lie with me. He tried to take advantage of me," and he got thrown into prison. Now, he got thrown into one of the nicer prisons because he was so respected by Potiphar, but he was still in prison nonetheless. Excuse me. But he remained faithful. He didn't give up on God then. After even that, he remained so faithful to God and so faithful to his masters that he was even exalted in the prison. He was doing so good that he was raised up in the prison. And he went through some times where he interpreted some dreams. And when he did that, and he did great things for the Pharaoh, he was actually promoted second only to Pharaoh. He was put in charge of the entire kingdom. Here in Genesis 41, 40 and 42, 40 through 42, it says, "You shall be over my house, and all of my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And Joseph was put in charge of everything. He had made his case to Pharaoh that God was on his side, and Pharaoh wanted that. So he put him in charge of everything. And that is where God wanted him. Because there was about to be some great, great prosperity in the land, and then followed by famine. And Joseph knew that if they stored up during the prosperity, they would have enough to get through the famine. And so that's where God wanted him, because not only was he able to take care of all of Egypt, he was actually able to take care of his family who were experiencing the famine. They came and was trying to buy the grain. He took care of them. And after all that was done, and they were all reunited, Pharaoh gave them land and allowed them to prosper. The descendants of Jacob, which now he's called Israel, and ultimately the descendants of Abraham, going back to all of that, were given the land and they multiplied greatly, making them a mighty people. And that was because of the faithfulness of Abraham and his descendants. You know, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then on down to Joseph. They were all faithful throughout throughout that entire time. Though sometimes some of them faltered, sometimes were maybe a little bit dishonest, but they followed God's plan. They may have, like I said, veered from it once in a while, but they got back there and they pressed on. And so, may we always have faith, remembering that God has done many things in the past to help us through. And we have to remember those things, because that's what God has for us. We have to know that. And we, just like Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as they remembered the past and all the good things that God did and kept them having faith, we need to remember that as well. So I want to thank you very much for being here and listening to this video, watching this video. Remember, get out there, read Genesis, and then prepare and read Exodus as well. I hope that you guys have a great week. God bless. Remember to walk daily with Jesus.